I want to discuss Pascal's wager and the various objections that we can have to it. It is one hoary old chestnut, but it's still a hoary old chestnut that has to be dealt with because it is still used against atheists with quite some regularity, and I'm sure long after we've all gone and found out that the wager was an absolute waste of time, or not found out the wager was an absolute waste of time because we'll be dead and we'll know no more than we did before we were born, the wager will still be being used. Well, first off, let's make sure we're all singing from the same hymn sheet here. So the wager was a construction of a Mr. Blaise Pascal, who was a Frenchman in the 17th century who had a very big interest in mathematics and probability, especially. He was also a very devout man, and he was a Christian philosopher. And let me give you a kind of rundown on the formulation of his wager. So the basis of Pascal's wager is that it's presented as if it's a dichotomy: either God exists or God does not exist. And then the reasoning from that point onwards is really rather straightforward and understandable, because if God exists and we believe that he exists, then it's really rather marvellous. We get to spend an eternity in heaven doing wonderful things for an infinite period of time. However, if God exists and we didn't believe in him, then we end up spending an eternity in hell with sharp pointy spikes being stuck up our bottom, which after all is probably not what most of us would choose to have done for an infinite period of time. And note, those are my words I'm using there, not Blaise Pascal's. Contrast that with the situation where God does not exist. If God does not exist, then it doesn't matter a damn whether you believed in him or didn't believe in him. The same fate awaits. If God does not exist, you just die, and that is the end of it. So what Blaise Pascal is saying is that on the basis of that, it makes absolute sense to believe in God, because if you believe in God, you stand to gain heaven. And the worst possible thing that can happen is that you have a few minor inconveniences through life. God doesn't end up existing, and then nothing happens. Whereas if you don't believe in God, well, if you happen to be right, you've not gained anything. If you happen to be wrong, you've shit it, son. So that's kind of where Blaise Pascal was coming from. So, of course, this is an argument against atheism that has been rebutted for as long as it has been around, and I'm sure all of you will have heard some of the rebuttals of Pascal's wager. What I want to do in this video is to present and evaluate for different rebuttals, one after another. So if you're the kind of person that accepts, like myself, that there is a finite possibility that a God exists, and I know that people accept finite possibilities for all kinds of things, not just God's existing. Some people accept a finite possibility for magic existing. Somebody said to me the other day they thought there's a finite possibility that there are other versions of ourselves out there in the universe getting on with their lives, and that one day we could stumble upon them. Sounds the most ridiculous load of tripe I think I've ever heard of, to be quite honest. Sorry, I thought I heard something there. But this specifically then deals with the finite possibility that God exists. If you believe in that, then Pascal's wager needs rebutting. Let's get on with the 4 rebuttals. So I think probably the first one we should consider is the one that everybody's familiar with. It's the one we hear most often, even though I think in many ways it's the weakest one. It's the one that chimes in with the thing that Richard Dawkins always says when somebody says to him, "What if you're wrong, Richard?" And he comes back, "Well, what if you're wrong? What if Zeus exists? What if Odin exists? Etc, etc, etc. And what if they do exist? What about if the people on the Pacific island of Tanna were right all along and the Duke of Edinburgh turns out to be God?" I mean, I've got to say it. At least we know the Duke of Edinburgh at least exists. But it's a valid argument, isn't it? It's a valid argument. What about if some other God exists? Because let's be honest, At least as an atheist, right, all you've done is you've just failed to worship the God that exists. But perhaps Zeus or Odin would rather you worship no God than to worship a false God, to worship the wrong God. I don't know about the Duke of Edinburgh. We could probably ask him, though I don't know whether he watches this channel. I don't know whether he would reply. But I think this is the weakest argument. And to show you why I think it's the weakest of the four arguments, have a look at the second argument and I'll explain why. Okay, so the second rebuttal I'm going to present to you takes the form of an analogy, and this is the analogy. Once you finish watching this video, I want you to leave your house by the front door, but I have a warning for you. I suspect that outside your front door, a few feet from the door and about the width of a doormat, there is a hole. You can't see the hole, it's invisible from the top. It'll just look as if it's not there. But I'm telling you that I believe that it is there, that it is a deep hole with spikes at the bottom and probably a few bears as well. It's not a hole that you want to fall down. So what are you going to do when you leave your house? Are you going to A, open the door slightly gingerly and then shimmy round the edge of your doormat just on the off chance that there is a hole there? Or are you just going to walk off and leave your house as you do on every other occasion? Well, if we take the Pascal's wager approach, there's very little to be lost by shimmying round the doormat. But there's a great deal to be gained in the event that I'm correct and the hole actually exists. But I contend to you that not a single one of you, other than the bloody-minded awkward ones, will shimmy round their doormat. Now, if you took the first rebuttal at face value, the reason you won't be shimmying round your doormat is because there could be another hole next to your doormat, and by avoiding the hole under your doormat, all you could end up doing is falling down the other hole. But of course we know that that isn't why you just plough on regardless. The reason that you plough on regardless is because you regard the possibility that that hole actually exists as so vanishingly small that you're not even going to give it time of day. I think this is more what goes on with people's decision making. This is more why people don't bother taking up Pascal's wager than the first rebuttal. But there's two more rebuttals to have a look at. Let's have a look at the third rebuttal. So you probably noted that second rebuttal critically depended on us thinking that the chance of God existing is very, very low. So low that we can pretty much dismiss it. But what about if we thought the chance of God existing was substantially higher? What about if we thought that it was 1 in 6? Well, imagine if I asked you to roll a dice. You're going to roll it once. Do you believe, I'm asking you a question, do you believe in your heart that it's going to land 6? Can you make yourself believe that it will land a 6? Well, no, because you know that there's a 1 in 6 chance of it landing a 6. There's a 5 out of 6 chance that it won't land a 6, and you know that. You can't convince yourself otherwise. But what about if I told you about the dice god? Just as Blaise Pascal tells us about the penalty for getting it wrong, let me tell you about the penalty for getting it wrong here. If you roll a 1, 2, 3, 4 or 5, nothing happens, and it doesn't matter whether you believed in Dice God or not. But if you roll a 6, then Dice God exists. And if you believed in Dice God, then you go up to Dice Heaven. And you get to play Yahtzee with God. It's fun for all the family for all of eternity. But if you roll a 6 and you don't believe in God, then you go down to Dice Hell, where the dice devil exists. And then it's terrible because he's got these pointy dice and he sticks these pointy dice right up your ass for all of eternity. I said pointy dice. It just doesn't work. If you don't think pointy dice, it doesn't work. It's intrinsic to the discussion, pointy dice. So now I've told you about Dice God and about Dice Heaven and about Dice Hell with the dice, the sharp, pointy dice. Now do you believe? Now surely I've swayed the balance, and now you are going to truly believe that that dice will land a 6 because it's in your interest to believe that it lands a 6. Of course it just doesn't work like that, because however much you know that it would benefit you to believe that the dice lands a 6, you know in your heart of hearts that there's still a 1 in 6 chance of it landing a 6. And if that means you end up with pointy dice being stuck up your ass, then so be it. There's no way of avoiding that fate. And that brings us on to the last of the rebuttals. So for the final of the 4 rebuttals, I'm going to pass you over to Mr. Christopher Hitchens, largely because he is a lot more eloquent than I am. Admittedly, I'm a lot more alive than he is, and on balance I think I probably got the better deal there. So here is Christopher Hitchens after he'd been diagnosed with terminal cancer, being interviewed by Jeremy Paxman, who's just given him Pascal's wager and asked him whether he would be accepting the wager. Mr. Christopher Hitchens.
I think it's his lowest point is what's called his wager, or sometimes his gambit, where he says, rather like a huckster, what have you got to lose? You win everything if you bet on God, and you've everything to lose if you're wrong. Well, what does this involve, if it's correct? It involves a very cynical God, and a rather stupid one, who will say, I noticed you make a profession of faith just there, and I also, because I'm God, I know why you did, because it was in the hope of winning favor with me. Well, that's fine. You'll therefore get it. That seems to me a rather contemptible thing, and necessarily, therefore, to entail a rather contemptible human being who says, I don't really believe this.
A sad loss, Christopher Hitchens. And I think that Christopher hints in that video at perhaps something that supersedes all of the other rebuttals, which is just the absolute absurdity of the wager when we're talking about a being that is supposed to be omniscient, that is supposed to be able to read what is truly in your hearts. If you're an atheist, you may as well own your atheism, because you are not going to be able to convince God that you believe anything other than you actually do believe, in the unlikely event that we are wrong. Well, I hope this video has given you something to think about. Perhaps next time somebody gives you Pascal's wager, something new to throw back in their direction. I thank you all very much for watching, and bye for now.